Welcome to PM Express Business Edition. It is often seen as remote or something that some people think they will never get to that time of life. When I'm talking about pensions. But as we talk about pensions, how do you ensure that the sector is well regulated to ensure that when that company or that fund manager promises you that at that age of retirement, all those benefits will come to you? Well, this and other issues wrapped up on PM Express Business Edition as we look at pension sector regulations in Ghana today as you engage the Chief Executive of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate it so much. And how are you doing? It's been quite an interesting sector, some would say, looking at the current challenges. How has it been for you and i.e. looking at this particular sector?
Well, the pensions industry has always been a very important industry because it's one of the inevitabilities of life that you would work and one day you will retire. And when you retire, you want to have a good pension that will give you retirement income security. And when that time comes, there are no second chances. And therefore, it needs to be prepared for, it needs to be planned very well, and needs to be well regulated. And that's what makes pension industry a very important one.
Some interesting things have taken place in this sector and this recent time, the past year, and even coming into this year as well. And many would not forget about the restructuring, the pensions industry and all the rest. And some would say that for you as a regulator, it was quite an interesting time where some would say stamping your authority to ensure that that pension or that contributor is protected.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting and very warming and welcoming because this is where the regulator and the stakeholders have had to team up and work together with government to ensure that the ultimate consumer, which is the contributor, the worker, does not suffer. And indeed, over the past year or 2 years, as you have said, since COVID time, the regulator and then the stakeholders and government have always been engaging to ensure that ultimately people do not lose out, because the new pension system started edging out people into retirement from the year 2020. And therefore, 2020 was always going to be a defining year. I mean, forget about COVID or anything that happened. Whatever it was always going to be a defining year for pension regulation because the new 3-tier pension was beginning to edge out its first retirees. Yeah.
Again, come back to this restructuring of the pensions fund. Someone was saying that we're not feeling the presence of the regulator because this action by government, one way or the other, impacted the contributor. And people were expecting the regulator to come in and ensure that the right things are done and how this whole restructuring was being done and all the rest.
The regulator was always there, has never been absent. And that's what I said, pension is a tripartite system. It is the contributor, it is the player, the manager, and it is the regulator. Of course, for second-tier pension, the risks are with the contributors. Government is not the underwriter, and unlike the basic national social security, that the government is the underwriter. So when times like this, as has been enumerated from 2020 come up, when times like these come up, that is where the regulator does not carry a stick, as it were, but becomes very collaborative with stakeholders to make sure that there is understanding, there's consensus building. And that is a role that the regulator has played over the last 2-3 years.
Let's look at, for instance, the restructuring of these pension funds as well. Did the regulator give his blessings to it, and did you ensure that whatever form this took, at the end of the day, me as a contributor, my contributions are safeguarded and ensure that the right things were done?
The decision to restructure Ghanaian debt was a decision of government, and it was a macroeconomic decision that the government had to take. And it wasn't about pensions alone, it was about banking, insurance, the securities industry. So the whole economic sector or the financial sector. And indeed we all work together, but of course you understand that I think the first part of the restructuring, pension funds were excluded.
Yeah.
And it was all because of the work that the regulator, the government, and stakeholders did together to ensure that let's take a step back and look at how we deal with this together. So pension funds were excluded, but the most important thing was that in the MOU that was signed between the stakeholders and government, we said that we would look at a more lasting solution to the macroeconomic situation that we find ourselves. And you can see just this August, a new alternative offer came.
That was done in the last
pension funds looked at it, and they felt that this time we're ready, and they have now.
And for you, you believe that you have played your role to ensure that I am protected and the outlook or the future for me is quite safe.
We did our best. Yes, we did our best as regulators. You see, again, there is a style of regulation. There's a style of supervision, you know, and it is not about holding the cane and whipping everybody in line, but it's about making sure that your stakeholders are within a consensus building structure and they all agree. And that is how the regulator over the last 3 years has played their role. And I believe this is the best approach. Yeah.
Let's come to contributors or workers, and let's look at even contributors, and let's look at SNET and all this whole pension scheme as well. And there have been concerns about workers or maybe employers meeting their obligations. From your end, looking at the numbers, what has been the situation? And as a regulator, how are you also ensuring that employers and even government and all the rest, they meet the obligations when it comes to contributions?
Yeah, pensions all over the world are fraught with risks. Of course, there are prudential risks, whether investments are going to give you the best returns, or the contribution risk, whether employers or contributors are going to be paying on time, because it is the timely payment which will determine the returns and ultimately your benefit. So these things are risks that pertain in the pensions industry. And it is not strange to Ghana. And we do have situations where employers are not paying on time, some of them are defaulting, some of them even avoid. Yeah. And when it comes to that point, then that is where you have to heighten up your regulation through prosecution, for example, through inspections and examinations and things like that. So yes, they do come up. And when they do, then of course the regulator will have to go in with a little bit of a whipping stick. You know, that is why, and that is why the courts have also been very helpful for us. And quite a few recalcitrant employers have been taken to court.
Have you been cracking the whip? And I look at across board. So it is not just about a George Wiafe who is not paying the contributions of his workers, but across board. I mean, from government to big institutions and big private firms that are failing to pay these contributions on behalf of their workers.
We are. You remember when the Act was first passed, I don't know whether it was an oversight on the part of the drafters of the law. The regulator was not given powers to prosecute. The powers went to the Tier 1 managers, which is SNET. But we realized that the default was even more with Tier 2, for example. And so we had to go back to the law and look at how it can be amended. So a new LI then came in. But by the time we got the LI, which was in 2019, the backlog of default was huge, naturally. So we've been trying to clear the backlog. Fortunately, we have satellite offices all across the country. So we're not only fighting the default battle from Accra, we're doing it in Tamale, we're doing it in Sunyani, we're doing it in Takoradi, Kumasi, and so on and so forth. We've just recently started working in Kufuridua. So we're doing the best that we can, but there is still more work to do in terms of defaults and then cracking.
In terms of the cracking of the whip, have you seen an uptick in terms of people now responding more, in terms of these private firms, in terms of these big companies, and even in terms of government as well?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, that is where the regulator's work comes into play. Yes, government, we have been engaged in government strongly, especially on the public sector. Of course, with all the economic difficulties and the exchange and everything that took place, you would expect some bit of delays, but now coupons are being paid, you know, and so the backlog is clearing in terms of the private sector. As I said, across the country, our prosecutorial powers have kicked in, and I wouldn't say we are right on top yet, but we are making a lot of progress. I think we've been able to get, I think, to the extent of about 30 million, for example, from prosecutions, which don't come to the regulator. It goes to the managers of the schemes, because they are the ones who, by law, are entitled to take the collection.
For you as a regulator, are you worried about the environment and how that would impact on companies' ability to honor the contributions of their workers? And even government in the past had some challenges, but it appears they are moving on. For you as a regulator, is it a big worry to you? And how are you trying to engage these players to ensure that at least when it comes to the contributions, everything is done, not to default on it?
See, for the industry, for purposes of regulating the industry, even in difficult times, you have, as a regulator, to put in what we refer to as regulatory forbearance, where certain strict rules are relaxed over a period. You give directives, you give guidelines, you know. But one thing that you don't ever, as regulator, compromise on is the fact that the contributors' benefit suffer. You don't under any circumstance compromise on that. So we cannot, for example, say that because times are difficult, contributions are not to be paid. Of course, in Tier 3, you can have contribution holidays, but you can't have that in Tier 2, and you can't have that one in Tier 1, because ultimately, the person will retire, and you cannot say that over a certain period of time there were difficulties and therefore there was a gap in your contribution. No, you would have failed to ensure retirement income security.
I see. It's been some years in terms of the pension reforms and all the rest. Sitting back and looking at it, there are some who are so excited about it. There are some too who think that, well, there are still a lot of things to be done. Implementation of these reforms, are you satisfied, or do you believe that there's still a lot more work to be done?
A lot more work still needs to be done. You know, a lot more work, because pensions is a very dynamic industry. It's a very dynamic industry, and the value of money changes over a long period of time, and therefore you need to look at issues of investment, how you can always improve on it. You need to look at whether there are new products in the system that pension fund managers and trustees can invest in. You always want to ensure that the economy expands so that pension funds can be used, you know, to in the real sector of the economy, for example, so that they can turn out results or returns for contributors. So there's always a lot to be done. And then there are always going to be transitional issues that need to be resolved. And of course, the contributors themselves, whether whilst they are contributing, they've got all their data, you know, in place. For example, date of birth changes and all those things do affect ultimately when people receive their benefits and how they receive their benefits. So all these challenges are always going to be there. And that's why the regulator, you cannot take your foot off the pedal. You always have to constantly ensure that the changes that take place, you are on top of it, and you are also making sure that the stakeholders, the managers of the schemes are always, you know, in line.
I asked this question because there were some who of the school of thought that these reforms will ensure that some great value for contributors. There are some who argue that post-reforms, they are worse off. And some are also saying that post-reforms, well, they're getting what is due. What do you tell to the persons out there who are worried that post-reforms, they think they are worse off as contributors?
George, remember the reforms started in 2010. And there were people who were, let's say, just 50 years at the time. and they would have contributed for 10 years. You know, pension is a very, very long-term system, and it has to be patient. When you contribute to a system for 10 years, your returns would naturally not be as huge as somebody who contributes for 15, 20, 30. As the years go along, the reality of the superiority of the 3-tier pension system will kick in. And there is also, remember, it's a 3-tier pension system. We tend to focus on tier 1 and tier 2. But tier 3 is the golden fleece. I mean, 16.5% of your salary could go into tier 3, and it's always been the area that we've looked at, the informal sector and those who do tier 1 and tier 2, to do a top-up. And I think it is only when the 3 come together that is when the full realization of the benefits of the 3-tier system will kick in. Yeah.
So you think that it's just a matter of time?
It's a matter of time.
And those who've been complaining that they are not getting the real benefit of this.
Yeah, it's a matter of time, and it is also taking advantage of the full package, the 3-tier pension, the full package. That is how we are going to reap the actual benefits of the new
I'll be coming back to focus on your plan to delve into the informal sector, and also in terms of funding as well. How are these development partners coming on board? Because it's quite a very interesting area when it comes to regulating this sector. And also going forward, how do we ensure that these funding managers are doing the right thing in terms of where to invest and all those things? This is PM Express Business Edition, as I engage the Chief Executive of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority as I look at pension regulations in Ghana today. What can be done to ensure that contributors get value for their investment going forward? This is PM Express Business Edition. Be right back after this break. Welcome back to PM Express Business Edition as we look at pensions regulation in Ghana today. And how do you ensure that your contributions are safe, your investments are safe, and how difficult it is to regulate the sector in these interesting times as an economy and even as a country. I'm engaging the Chief Executive of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority, Mr. Hayford Attah Krufi, and he is the Chief Executive of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority. Thank you so much. I mean, there are still some people out there who are worried about the safety of their investment. From the report that you're seeing at your end, how safe are my contributions or investments?
Right. Okay, thank you. For investment, there is nothing like safe investment. Naturally, you know,
there are risks.
Every investment comes with risks.
You know what pension funds will say.
Yeah. So what trustees and fund managers promise is best returns, best effort. And that is where the prudential risk is. So, and in our law, we have to ensure that there is fair returns. So, and that is why the regulator always has to have a clear guideline on investment to look at relatively what would give the best effort, the best returns, and then the fair returns. Of course, taking into account the relativity of safety, but there's not like absolute safety. So what we have done as regulators is to give the industry a guide, some kind of a guideline, and we've given a certain asset classes that we believe that this would give the best effort or the best returns. For example, Government of Ghana securities, local government securities, corporate bonds or corporate securities, equities of shares, money market securities, for example, collective investment schemes, and then a whole of alternative investments, for example, in real estate and stuff like that. So those are the investment opportunities that are available in our country. And those ones, we've put them into a guideline and given to the industry. And that is what is guiding decision making as far as investment is concerned.
Some have argued that with the domestic detection program and what has happened, there is nothing like safe investment. And even the president, during the recent May Day celebration, made an argument about whether the time has come to review these laws as in where these pension funds can be placed. For you as a regulator, do you think that the time has come to take a second look at where these funds can be placed? Because we've come to understand that post this domestic relation program, there is nothing like safe or secured investment. And some are saying that in terms of returns as well, maybe we should look at varying areas that these pension funds can be invested.
Well, perhaps maybe I need to correct a little bit that it is not because of the domestic debt exchange, but naturally, I mean, in rules of finance, you know, investment has never been safe.
But in finance, we've been told often by the government bonds in the past, in our lecture rooms, universities, that these were, quote, the safest investments.
Relative safety. But of course, you see, sometimes too, when changes happen, you also don't react too quickly. And as I said, pension funds are patient fund. I mean, let's take it. The law says that somebody can join a pension scheme at the age of 15 and retire at the age of 60. This person has 45 years for their money to be in investment. So you look for this, the most patient and people of investment, and also people have different risk environments. You know, some higher consumers of risk, some are lower consumers of risk, depending on age and everything. And that is why in our investment guideline we have put in what we call the constituent funds, where different age groups funds are put in different investment vehicles. So the fact that what has happened over the last 1 year does not mean that you very quickly rush and change your investment.
You don't buy the argument that these investment laws should be reviewed in terms of where the pension funds can be placed because of what has happened just under a year.
It is dynamic. It is dynamic, and we are responding to it. We are responding to it. But I mean, I just want to underscore the fact that because this is happening does not mean that you throw the baby away with the bath water. Yeah, of course, you may review the percentages. You may review the per usual limits, but the 7 investable areas, as I indicated earlier, are still very useful. You may not want to put a higher premium on a particular asset class than the other. What I'm hearing from the industry, and which we are also looking at and considering, is the fact that maybe we need to look at the alternative investment. Now, alternative investments are those like in real estate, for example, investments that can affect the real sector of the economy. Project financing, for example, something which pension funds had not looked at seriously in the past. We may have to look at that, you know. And of course, other areas, even external investment, I mean, has been talked about, for example. My view is that we need to use pension funds to develop our Ghanaian economy before we think of taking it outside. That is my own personal assessment of it. So these things are being discussed. And of course, before you craft an investment guideline, you have to involve academia, you have to involve regulators, you have to involve the ministries, you have to involve the stakeholders themselves, the unions, the workers, and then the market players. So then you can get a consensus that this is where we want to go. And naturally you respond to that. So it is not a regulator's decision that because of X has happened and therefore we need to move from Y to...
Some will say that I mean, the fact that you have to engage industry players, you will still have the final say as in the way forward. But I get from you that, listen, we need to take our time. Don't need to rush and review the investment guidelines because of what has happened. And that's the understanding I get from the regulator.
Not to review that. Of course, it's dynamic.
As in rushing, because we still need some time before these adjustments are done.
Okay. But of course, some immediate adjustments can be made, for example, with the percentages.
Yeah. And is that something you're looking at as in, or still some engagement will influence that action that, listen, a percentage of these can go here and there, and it's looked at, right? Or it's work in progress,
It's a common sense approach that you don't put all your eggs in one basket, for example. And that is why you have a choice of securities to look at. I mean, here in Ghana, the equity market, it needs to be strengthened, you know, for us as pension funds. We think that the capital market is crucial. But we don't regulate the capital market. So we need to work with other regulators. You know, if the money market is good, we don't regulate that. We need to work with the, say, Bank of Ghana and so on and so forth. And we also may have to make sure that some of these bonds that are issued by corporate institutions are also rated. These are all new things that are coming to the market, and we all need to think through this. That's why I'm saying that don't rush, but we will get there.
But at least now we can look at the mix of percentage in terms of where can be placed. But reviewing the whole investment laws, we need some time. I mean, you talked about looking at the option where we can use these pension funds to develop our country. What has been the challenge in terms of what role these pension funds can play in national development? And also, when it comes to infrastructure development, what is the regulator doing about it to ensure that we can move more of these funds into infrastructure development and help develop the economy as well?
Products. The answer. The challenge is the product availability of investable products. Okay, that is why I talked about the expansion of the economy, which is very, very important for pension funds. The bigger the size of the economy, the better for pension funds to operate, because you are looking for new areas. African economies are always expanding in the year, and when new areas come in and then you put pension funds there, that's when you get the best return for your contributors. If you have a static economy, it doesn't help, and that's why pension funds do better in the developed economies than perhaps they do in Africa. But we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity here because our economies are always being rebased. They're always expanding. New areas are developing infrastructure. For example, there's always an infrastructure deficit. And when the economy moves in that direction, you know, then pension funds can follow. So the availability of products is very, very crucial for us.
We look at what some contributors are taking home at the end of pension or retirement, and some are saying that there's nothing to write home about. When you engage in it, they've argued that it is based on contributions. As a regulator, are you worried about what some people are taking home as benefits? Because even 300, 100, 50 Ghana cedis, and maybe that might not be their situation now, but the benefits are so low. There are some who are saying that, well, it boils down to your contributions. But at the end of the day, can anything be done to ensure that those who are going on retirement can take something good home?
Yeah. You asked Nate, and they were not wrong in the assessment. Of course, pension is a denominator of income. It's a deferred income. What you earn determines how much you are able to put aside. And the laws have put percentages on them, for example. So 18.5% of what you earn goes into pension, 5% into tier 2, and then 13.5% will go to SNIT, and SNIT will remit to the National Health Scheme, and so on and so forth. So those things are predetermined. And if the base is not big, naturally the 18.5% is not going to be big. And that is why I've always maintained that, look, if the base can support an extra 16.5, then that is where you need to look at provident fund, personal pensions, you know, or group personal pension schemes. So these are the things that will beef up what you will take home at the end of the day, at the end of your working life. So yes, salaries play a big role in retirement, and I don't think that assessment is wrong at all. Yeah.
But it looks like nothing can be done about it because of the fact that a significant section of those who've contributed to these schemes are taking little home.
Pension is at the end of it. You know, as far as I keep saying, there are no second chances. The opportunity is when you're working. The opportunity is when you are doing your collective bargain with your employer. That is where the opportunity to expand the base of your retirement package comes in. But when you hit 60, there aren't any second chances again. Of course, SNIT will do what we call the indexation at the end of every year. And then also, we have ensured that nobody is paid below the minimum wage, for example. So last year's indexation, I think we put the minimum at 343, for example, you know, a month. So gradually, it's improving. But The opportunity comes when you're doing your collective bargain with your employer.
Let's come to the sustainability of the scheme. And I've engaged some players, I've engaged SNIT, and they made an argument that going forward, maybe there might be the need to review the contributions that people are making to the scheme in terms of the percentage of your salary and all the rest. And that there have been some discussions even to move this into Parliament as well. As we speak right now, what is the status of, one, the sustainability of the scheme? An argument that let's review the amount that workers contribute, because 10 years, 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, we cannot be assured of the sustainability of the Tier 1 scheme.
Sustainability is very important, because that is what, keeps systems running. Whilst you are in a particular situation, you look ahead. And that's what pension is all about sustainability. Yes, and then our 3-tier system was born out of agitation. We all know the story between 1972 and 1991 and 2004, when comparisons were made between CAP 30 and then the SNIT scheme, and then the unions started, and then government responded. So national conversation is always very good. If we think that the 3-tier system and the percentages of contribution, the 5 and then the 13.5 is too small, and we need to up it up, yes, it can begin. As regulators, we're not against that kind of national conversation at all. The issue about CAP 30, whether it should continue or it should, shouldn't, and all those things. I mean, these things have come as a result of national discussion. So yes, if the will for changes, and I do know, for example, that the actuarial valuation, the last one that SNIT did, there was a recommendation that contributions need to be upped a little bit. Yeah. So all these are discussions that we're not opposed to at all.
But some will say that when it comes to the sustainability of the scheme, should we, sorry for my choice of dilly-dally with stakeholder engagement and all the rest? Because if the argument or the concern is that going forward, the scheme is not sustainable, maybe some will say that we shouldn't buy time with stakeholder engagement, and whether they are for it or not, the regulator has to take that bold step in taking those drastic measures right now to look at how the scheme or this can be corrected.
Yeah, I mean, of course, when a scheme is on comatose, of course, naturally, certain decisions will have to be done. But everything that has been done in terms of sustainability, what needs to be done immediately, what needs to be done in the medium term is being done. Of course,
like some will say, what is being done immediately? Because if SNIT had done actual and they put out a report that contributions have to be increased, some are saying that it shouldn't take us more than a year for an action to be taken on this.
Remember, the SNIT scheme is underwritten by government. And government is the biggest employer, and of course the private sector too. Now the private sector is even exceeding the public sector in terms of contributions to the SNIT.
Interesting. Why?
Yeah.
Is it because government is not paying, or
no,
more people are moving?
No. There are more
people in the private sector.
More people in the private sector employing. Yeah, so the private sector contributes more to the SNIT scheme than government contributes. It's just the percentages of participation, so and which is something that we should be happy about.
So I get from here about the industry engagement, but for you as a regulator, what are your thoughts on it in terms of whether indeed, as we speak, you support the argument from SNIT that contributions should be up in terms of percentage to sustain the scheme?
If you look at our 5-year development plan for the pensions industry, one key area is the sustainability of the basic national social security scheme, of course. And so for us as regulators, even the 3-year interval that the actuarial evaluation is done, we think is too long. We think that every year. So the SNIT will have to let us know what is going on and what we need to do. So one of the things, for example, that we are working with SNIT to ensure sustainability is to look at their investment guidelines, for example, so that we can restructure investment. Because when we talk about sustainability of a scheme, it is how the scheme funds are being invested and how it is turning out, and to ensure that they will be able to pay benefit. So it's one of those things that we as regulators are working with them on. The other thing too is to look at their administrative expenses, for example, and look at how we can make it, you know, trimmer and more effective, so that they can reach out and serve their clients or their members. So those are some of the things that we're working with. And there's always a technical committee level that we work with, and then there's my board and their board. We meet and we discuss issues. So all these things are ongoing supervisory role that we are playing to ensure sustainability of SNIT, for example.
But for you, I get from you that as a regulator, you support these calls, but the caveat is that should be dependent on a rigorous stakeholder engagement with private sector, with the government, before that implementation is done.
It's important. It's important. Yeah, because the SNIT scheme, by nature, social security schemes are underwritten by government. The risk is with government. The risk is with government. And the players are the employers. Even whether government is an employer or not, you know, it's a promise that the government made, and they've put a trust body to manage it on behalf of government. So it is very important that any discussion will have to involve government, and then also the players themselves, which are the employers, you know, and then of course the regulators we can make. You see, remember, the role of the regulator has always been to facilitate a consensus of impose. Yes.
Even though a regulator might have a view.
I don't agree with
I'm saying that not to impose. So even though we subscribe, or the regulator subscribe that, listen, for the sustainability of the scheme, maybe contributions has to be reviewed. It's still dependent on these critical stakeholders and what they think. This is PM Expert Business. It has to look at regulating the pensions industry and what can be done to ensure that there is real value for investment as a contributor. We'll be coming back to look at the informal sector, and also what is the regulator doing to ensure that the sector is safe and sound. This is PM Express Business Edition. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to PM Business Edition, as we look at pension sector regulations in Ghana today and what is being done to ensure that everything is safe and sound. I'm engaging the Chief Executive of the National Pensions Regulatory Authority and say thank you so much for your time. Again, talking about the sustainability of the scheme as well, there are some who say that just like what has happened in other countries, in Paris and even in other European countries, maybe the pensions age should be reviewed as well. From the regulator's perspective, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Some issues are regulatory and some are statutory, of course. Our mandate is to regulate and monitor the industry. When it comes to age of joining and age of leaving a scheme, those are determined by law. Act 766 talks about joining at 15. We all know that people hardly, for example, start work at 15 in our country, maybe 18, maybe 21, so on and so forth. Those things, because they are determined by law, that's how it should be. The 60 years is predetermined by the Constitution of the Republic of Ghana. You know, and it's an entrenched clause, for example. So it would not be part of our regulatory responsibility to amend or even talk about it. But I always believe that as the three-tier pension system was a result of public conversation and agitation, so we can have a conversation about the retirement age. And if that would mean that the Constitution will need to be looked at, then naturally it will be, it can be looked at. But it is statutory.
I asked this question because from the previous engagement about contributions, it boiled down to stakeholders. I have engaged SNIT, and they have come out on record about, they subscribe to that argument that if all these things would help with the sustainability of the scheme, and there are clear examples from other countries that have gone this way because they want to find ways to help sustain the scheme. The stakeholders appear to be more of support this argument. Do I get that from the regulator's perspective? You are open to this if the stakeholders are now making that case that it should happen?
It would be a good conversation. I mean, in Europe and other developed economies, you know, they have seen the sense in opening up because, you know, the retirement age and revising it upwards. Of course, it would not be, it's not done instant now from day one. Today, everybody retires at 62. No, there's something called grandfathering, where they will say people who are born at a certain age and as a certain year and at a certain age can retire at X, you know, years, and then it goes on, you know, subsequently. I think in UK now, I think it's 60, 67 for ladies, and then 65 for men, because the women live longer naturally. So these things happen. There's a shop in UK called B&Q. If you're not 60 years or above, they will not even hire you because they think people are their prime and they're more, they are able to work. I don't know. That is what is informing their decision. But when you go to their shop floor, you see people who are quite aged, but they are working very actively. So the world is changing. All these issues need to be looked at. But the African society, the African population is also relatively young. So the question is, how do you hire people into a system which may be choked at some point in time, for example? So you need to look at the argument from both perspectives, from the young people's perspective and also from the old people's perspective. And then you begin to see ultimately what will bring productivity, what will bring more contribution, and how people can retire on a stronger pension. So all those, so it is not about a number, but it's about the advantage that a particular number can bring to the society. But I am open to a conversation on it.
And where would that conversation lead to? Because then there's a tendency that we can have a discussion, but it will not lead to anything. What will this conversation then lead to? By looking at a situation where there are 3-year, 4-year, if government and even all the critical private sectors are for it.
George, do you know that when Cap 30 started, people were retiring at 50?
Yeah,
Ghana, people have retired at 50 before. If you look at our constitution, if you work with the audit service, you could retire at 45, you know, and then everybody else retires at 60. So the age thing is not something that cannot be looked at. It is something that, you know, we started from 50, now go to 60. We can always review it upwards or even downwards. That's the way we want to go.
There are still stakeholder engagement going on, and even looking into the future. There's this argument about Cap 30 that you spoke about and going forward. For you, what should be done with this?
The regulator is very open-minded to that conversation, and I think we would be very interested to see that conversation take a national, you know. Of course, our parliament is very, very important, especially because they are the ones who own the constitution of Ghana. And it will be interesting to see PM Express talking to maybe a majority leader or a minority leader or a speaker
because it comes back still about the sustainability of the scheme and going for. There are some who think that it should be scrapped and added to the tier 1 and all the rest, and because going forward, they will get to a time that 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, a government that will be in power that may not be able to meet the contributions of that scheme.
The good thing about you, George, and your program, and of course your institution, is that you've talked to a number of people. You're talking to me today. You've talked to other stakeholders, and you begin to see the consensus of mind, what people are thinking, or the direction that the nation wants to go. And I think some decisions are informed by, the view of the media, for example, because you have had different minds and different mindsets talking, perhaps converging on a particular issue. For example, I've told you that we are open-minded to it. So you would say that the regulator, for example, is not, is open-minded to it. So what is stopping us?
We knew about tier 1, tier 2, and the third tier. Why, if I stand to be educated, the sudden interest from the regulator's perspective about the informal sector? Because it appears that it is quite a large space, and it appears that you were worried in terms of how they can also be brought on board so they can benefit from a secured future.
African economies, and Ghana is no exclusion to that. It's the fact our economies are informal based. I always say we are a nation of shopkeepers. Everybody wants to do self-employment. Everybody wants to work for themselves. And our economies are in such a structure or shape that it cannot always sustain from the formal point of view. So where majority of us are in the informal sector, naturally a pension system must look at that, because all these people are going to face the inevitability of retiring one day. And how does the nation support them? How does so old age poverty, if we want to tackle old age poverty, then pensions should begin to look at the informal sector. Currently, we have about 9 million people who are in the informal sector by our last count of our statistics. And these people, only about 6% of them are in the, have a scheme one way or the other, whether it is a personal pension scheme or a group personal pension scheme. And so you begin to see the numbers are quite low. For us, we aim to get to 25% by 2026, according to our strategic plan. But even then, the numbers will still be low. You need to aim higher. So as regulators, we worry about how slow the informal sector is picking up the call for pensions for all. People still have the perception that pension is only for the blue or the white-collar worker. And that perception needs to be driven down and taken out, because it is going to affect people's retirement eventually.
As we try and wrap up on this discussion, I was going to find out from you, how's the tier 2 doing in terms of the reports that you've seen? I mean, for SNIT, you can go through their annual report and see how it's faring. Tier 2, how is it doing?
Tier 2 is doing extremely well. I think we have about 38 billion currently as the asset under management, and it is growing. It is growing by the day. So it's doing very well. It's doing very well, I would say. But there's still more to do, because there are companies that are not contributing for their members. Some are also...
And what is happening to them?
Yeah, I mean, avoidance.
Yeah.
Some are also defaulting, and some simply do not know that they have to pay. Of course, ignorance is no excuse, and that is where our compliance officers have to hit the ground running. For example, we have opened a new office, a regional office in Tema, which is dedicated for that. So you'll be in your compliance. So you'll be in your workplace, and then my compliance officers will hit on you, give us evidence of payment of your tier 2. And if you're not able to, then we will lead to court. So that is one of the faces that we are using, especially in the Tema and Greater Accra. That's the Greater Accra regional office.
Your surveillance and monitoring to ensure that.
Absolutely.
Finally, as we wrap up on this, I mean, from all this work that you're doing, maybe I stand to be educated in terms of your act. How are you drawing the funding to run the authority, and some development partners coming on board to support your operations?
We do get technical assistance. Yeah, for example, we've just recently ended one with the Swiss government, the SECO project. So they come in to help us strengthen our governance and our management. They come in to strengthen our supervisory powers, and then they also come to enhance our capacity as far as education and sensitization is concerned. But these are technical support that we get. But for us as an authority, Our revenue is also from the pensions industry.
Okay.
You know,
Okay.
from the asset under management, they give us some small change that we use to manage ourselves.
Small persuasion. And I know the debate will still go, and we'll be looking forward to that stakeholder engagement in terms of restructuring and making the industry solid and more robust. Mr. Hayford Attah Krufi, I appreciate your time. So when I know the debate will still go on in your homes and your offices in terms of what can be done to sustain these schemes out there, and whether the time has come for the investment laws to be reviewed to ensure that you get real value for money. My name is Wiafe. Have a great day. This is PM Express Business Edition.